What's the most violent act of racism that you could ever imagine? I'll give you time to think about it. Tell me, what comes to mind? Well, I'm going to take you down the journey of one, if not the most gruesome act of racism known in the 20th century. His name, James Byrd Jr. James Byrd Jr. was born May 2nd, 1949 in Beaumont, Texas, to Stella and James Byrd Sr. He was the third oldest of 8 children. His life was pretty typical of the average black male in the South in the 1960s. His life revolved around school and church. His mother was a Sunday school teacher, while his father was a deacon of the church in his community. A young James was considered to be exceptionally bright and charismatic, graduating from Jasper High School in 1967. A side note historical fact, James Byrd was a part of the last segregated class in the history of that school. Despite being academically inclined, he didn't choose to attend college. He chose to enter the workforce as a vacuum salesman, and he also got married and had 3 children, Renee, Ross, and Jamie. Throughout his years of adulthood, James struggled with alcohol. In turn, led to a divorce from his wife in 1993. After the divorce in 1996, he returned to Jasper, set to improve his life by entering the Alcohol Anonymous group. I would like for you guys to meet John William King, Russell Brewer, and Sean Berry. These are the 3 men, in my opinion, that will change history forever. Have you ever heard of Huff Creek Road? If you haven't, let me tell you the significance of this particular road. This was the road where James Byrd Jr. was murdered. As the story has it, Byrd was heading home from a place that's unknown, and he saw the 3 men riding in a truck and hitched a ride with the 3 men. As the research shows, the only reason he hitched a ride was because he knew Sean Berry around town and was comfortable enough to get in the vehicle with the 3 men. Instead of taking James home, the 3 men took James Byrd on Huff Creek Road, where they beat him severely, spray painted his face, urinated, and defecated on him. Then the 3 men continued to chain James Byrd up by his ankles and drug him 3 miles. Forensics shows that Byrd tried to keep his head up during most of the dragging, but he died halfway through the dragging when his right arm and head were severed as his body hit a culvert. His brain and skull were found intact, which showed James Byrd was conscious during most of the dragging. The 3 men dumped James Byrd's body in front of an African American church. After dumping the body, the 3 men casually went to a barbecue. The next morning, his body was found by a pedestrian. Along the road where James Byrd was dragged, they found a wrench which had Berry written on it. Along Huff Creek Road, police found 81 places where James Byrd's remains were. John William King. He was accused of beating Byrd with a bat and then dragging him behind a pickup truck until he died. King, prior to the murder, had recently been released from a Texas prison, said that he had been repeatedly gang raped in prison by black inmates. Lawrence Russell Brewer. He was a white supremacist who, prior to Byrd's murder, had served a prison sentence for drug and possession and burglary. He was paroled in 1991. After violating his parole conditions in 1994, Brewer returned to prison. According to his court testimony, he joined the white supremacist prison gang with King in order to safeguard himself from other inmates. Brewer and King became friends in a Beto unit prison. Sean Berry claimed that Brewer and King were almost entirely responsible for the crime. Brewer, however, testified that Berry had cut Byrd's throat before he was tied to the truck. The jury decided that little evidence supported his claim. As a result, Berry was spared the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison. As of 2020, Berry was living in protective custody at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Ramsey Unit and will be first eligible for parole when he is 63 years old in June 2038. The end result is stated: Sean Berry is serving life in prison. Lawrence Brewer was put to death by lethal injection on September 24, 2011, and John William King was executed on April 24, 2019. James Byrd's family created James Byrd Foundation for Racial Healing. Basketball Hall of Famer Dennis Rodman paid for James Byrd's funeral expenses and also gave the family $25,000. Also, the fight promoter Don King put up $100,000 towards Mr. Byrd's kids' educational expenses. In May 2004, two white teens, Joshua Lee Talley and John Matthew Fowler, were arrested and charged with criminal mischief for desecrating James Byrd's grave with racial slurs and profanities. The 77th Texas legislature passed the James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Act. In 2009, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crime Prevention Act expanded the 1969 United States federal hate crime law to include crimes which are motivated by a victim's actual or perceived gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. If a person can take anything from something like this, it is that racism is very real. And this isn't something that happened 50 to 60 years ago. This happened in 1998. I personally was 8 going on 9 years old. This wasn't that long ago. And this has to be one of the most horrific acts of racism I ever heard of. My thoughts and prayers go out to Mr. Byrd and his family, and especially his children. I couldn't fathom what to do if something like this happened to anybody that I cared about or knew. But it goes to show that there are people that will go out their way to hurt or harm you for no reason at all because of the color of your skin. This was indeed the hate crime, and the justice was served. But all in all, if we could take anything from this, it will be the words from his sisters from a statement that they released after his death, and the statement read, "Having a loved one tortured and lynched produced unimaginable sense of loss and pain. How does one respond to such a brutal act? Retaliation, hateful speech, or promotion of hate-written propaganda never entered our mind. We thought, what would Jesus have done? How would he have responded? The answer was crystal clear. His message would have been one of peace and hope."
As far as any regrets, no, I have no regrets.